everybody, what's going on? Helmlight here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the experimental Kayle changes that are currently on PvE, and generally speaking, Riot's, I guess, philosophy on how they nerf champions that are in difficult situations. And now that sounds very vague, and it is, but I will get to explaining myself here in a little bit. Now, first and foremost, let's talk about the Kayle change list. So now, a Rioter recently pushed out on Twitter basically a blast to say, hey, these Kayle changes are going to be going live on the PvE. They are definitely experimental, but the idea being to solve some of the issues that they feel that Kayle is having, which are that Kayle feels absolutely terrible in the early game, actually the worst champion in the game, could probably lose a fight 1v1 with a squishy champion like Sona or Zyra at level 1, just like actually you feel more like a melee minion than you do a champion at early levels. But then by the time you hit level 16, you are bar none the best champion in the game. You have insane range, you have really high damage, you do a bunch of true damage for free, so there isn't even any way to itemize defense against Kayle, you just kind of die to her. And essentially, the goal with these changes is to sort of smooth that curve out a little bit, so you don't feel quite as bad in the early game, and you feel significantly a little bit worse in the later game. Now, I'm not going to go through all the changes because there are a lot to break down, but suffice it to say, you now evolve into your range form at level 6. You do have a slightly lower range and slightly lower attack speed per stack at level 6, but you still get your range form at level 6. And in your Transcendent form, you no longer do true damage, but you get an additional 50 range to go up to 575, which is a pretty long auto attack range. There are a bunch of other changes on her other abilities, but that's essentially the gist of it, and the biggest change, I think, here, in that it smooths out a bit of Kayle's ability to play the early game because you get that first evolution at level 6, you have the ranged auto attacks, you're no longer just going to get bullied out, but you also aren't just going to destroy everybody in the later stages of the game. Now, on one hand, these changes are alright. I'm not necessarily disappointed in them. I do think that, hey, this would be a nice change to Kayle, especially given that it's a change in the earlier stages of the game, and those are almost always more meaningful than nerfs in the later stages of the game, because so much of League of Legends is decided during the laning phase or during the first 10 minutes of the game, and it's very difficult to get to the part where late game is actually going to matter. However, at the same time, I think that these changes are sort of working against what the rework was designed to fix. And let me sort of explain myself here. Before the rework, Kayle was supposed to be the same sort of champion she is now, which is very, very weak in the early game, but one of the best champions in the game when she hits late game. So, in that regard, Kayle was somewhat played along with that, but she wasn't also necessarily as weak in the early game as she should have been, nor as dominant in the late game as she should have been. Kayle, sure, she was weak early, but she had access to ranged auto attacks pretty much any time she wanted them. She had the ability to just kind of, survive the lane, scale it out, get whatever CS she could. But then the late game, she wasn't just absolutely going to destroy you. She had windows of opportunity where she really could make herself known. There were issues with the old Kayle, especially since her ultimate didn't prevent her from auto-attacking. So in the later stages of the game, you'd have a champion that could just make herself invincible for 3 seconds and DPS your whole team. So that meant that necessarily restricted how good she could be late, because otherwise she'd be an invincible hyper carry, and there were problems with having that in the game. So essentially the problem is that she's supposed to be weak, super weak early, super strong late, but we never really get that out of old Kayle. She ended up having the ability to sort of survive lanes, and even in some situations bully lanes if you played her top lane, but she wasn't also just going to destroy everybody in the later stages of the game because of the power she had. The Kayle rework, conversely, and I've talked about this in my first couple of podcasts about the Kayle rework, the changes that they made in the rework really did go a long ways towards accentuating her strengths and weaknesses. Yeah, she got way, way weaker in the early stages of the game, to the point where, yeah, you pretty much lose to every single champion in lane. But she's also so much stronger now in the later stages of the game that it sort of makes up for that. Kayle is supposed to be a super, super strong champion in the game, but I don't think she's also unbeatable in the later stages of the game. I really don't. I think that late game Kayle is really no different than any other hyper carry, in that, sure, if you can't get on top of somebody like a Kog'Maw, well, the Kog'Maw is going to kill everyone on your team. If he's not threatened, Kog will kill everybody. And it's the same with Kayle. If Kayle's not threatened, Kayle will kill every single member of your team while dealing significant amounts of true damage, but at the same time, if Kayle is if you get the dive on top of Kayle, or if you're able to lock her down, she's just gonna die. She doesn't have that much durability, she doesn't have that much utility. She has to be able to cast a spell in order to use her ultimate, so if she's chain CC'd, she's just gonna die and not be able to ever use that ability. And she's super squishy, she doesn't have a lot of abilities outside of that, so it's really easier to get her low, force her to panic ult herself, and then she's probably still gonna have to run away from the fight because she's too squishy to just sort of keep attacking, she's not gonna sustain enough through it, etc, etc. So in my opinion, the Kayle rework basically accentuated the strengths and weaknesses, and that makes for a better design. You feel super weak in the early game, but you also feel incredibly strong in the late stages of the game, and that's where you want to be with this champion. You don't want to be, well, I'm weak early, but I always have ranged auto attacks, so I can bully this guy when my E is up, so I have this, but also late, I'm not just going to kill everybody, there are some weaknesses to what I can do. That feels significantly worse. And to kind of extend this into, I guess, some other examples here, Riot do have a tendency of nerfing the unique things of a champion's kit and sort of homogenizing them and making them so that they don't necessarily feel very unique. A good example of this is Aurelia, where they removed the disarm from Aurelia's ultimate in exchange for buffing the damage and the slow. Now, on one hand, did Aurelia need nerfs? 100%. I'm not even going to disagree that something had to change, and that did cut out some extraneous power of her kit that wasn't even necessary. But on the other hand, it would have been, I think, significantly nicer instead for Riot to nerf her utility on that ability, nerf the damage, nerf the slow, and instead keep the disarm. Maybe even buff the disarm so it lasts a longer period of time. In that regard, Aurelia is significantly more, there's a lot more reason to pick her. She has this unique part about her where you pick Aurelia because you want this giant disarm. She maybe ends up being really good against AD auto attack centric compositions because she can throw out the ultimate in the middle of a team fight, hit a bunch of champions, get them to be disarmed, dive on top of them, they try to run away, they can't auto attack her back. There are a bunch of advantages that you have for doing this as opposed to giving her sort of a generic damage over time, or sort of generic AD nuke that hits a bunch of people, gives you the resets, gives you the slows if you try to run away. There are a lot of champions that have abilities like that. A good example, I would say, is someone like Lissandra. Her ultimate does damage in an area of effect. It has a CC component. It has a slow component. Like, that sort of thing, to me, is sort of the, there's a lot of overlap there between her kit, her ability, and Aurelia's ability. And I would really love to see that not to happen, instead for Riot to focus on the disarm aspect, but they didn't do that. And I think the Kayle changes are another way in which they're sort of homogenizing a champion's kit, and that they're making Kayle yet another character that's kind of bad early, but is going to be really good late, but isn't necessarily super bad early and super good late. I would prefer Riot to keep the big disparity between the two Kayles in order to really accentuate the parts where Kayle does feel weak versus when Kayle does feel strong. I think that leads to a stronger design. I think that leads to more memorable characters, and I think that overall leads to, I think, a better design philosophy to preserve what's unique about the character instead of making them like every other character that's similar. But that's sort of my opinion. I know a lot of people are excited about the Kayle changes. They like having the champion actually feel like they can do something in the early stages of the game. So let me know what you guys think of all this down in the comment section below. Would love to hear your thoughts, especially if you like the changes. Why do you like the changes? Let me know. If you enjoyed today's video, go ahead and leave a like. And if you really enjoyed today's video, consider subscribing. I put a video like this every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.